All right, my English teacher friends. So in this video, I want to continue my line of series here where we're going to tackle teaching line of reasoning. So as we know, as composition instructors, it's one of the hardest things to do, to teach students concretely how to think cogently on paper. And I've done a series in my YouTube channel over the last month or so where we've explored how my template of the declarative and the inverted thesis, which we use to construct the introductory paragraphs and to ensure that students get anchored in a thesis, as well as the syllogistic method, which is the template that I use to tackle the body paragraphs across the expository modes. So for lit analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, my students always uniformly execute the syllogistic method. So in the past, we used if you give a mouse a cookie, and we use P.D. Eastman's Are You My Mother? And in this video, what we're going to take a look at is there was an old lady who swallowed a fly. And one of the things I'm noticing in a lot of children's literature is that, I don't know, maybe through osmosis or extension, we're teaching our young readers inductive and deductive reasoning skills. And I was working with a couple of children's librarians and elementary school teachers, kind of looking at their lesson plans around these bedtime stories, these children's stories. And I said, holy cow, this is exactly what we're trying to do at the secondary level with our writers. So I know that sometimes line of reasoning is the domain, the exclusive domain of our AP classes for Lang and Lit, but it's really not. So I talk about line of reasoning with, 7th and 8th graders, 9th graders. It's really important to get our students to be able to, think in a computative, mathematical, cogent, well-reasoned, well-articulated line of reasoning from start to finish in their essay. So what I'm going to do in this is borrow the storyline of There Was an Old Lady Who Swallowed a Fly to show you how to construct an essay, literary analysis for Mary Oliver's poem, The Black Snake. And I'll do some follow-ups on this video where we'll do it for rhetorical analysis, synthesis, argument, and persuasion. Likewise, using There Was an Old Lady Who Swallowed a Fly. So let me dive right in. So I quite literally do story time with my students, kind of sit around in the circle like kindergarten, first grade, and we read this story. And just look at it real quick, just an excerpt from it in terms of how it logically proceeds. There was an old lady that swallowed a dog. What a hog to swallow a dog. She swallowed the dog to catch the cat. She swallowed the cat to catch the bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed a fly. Perhaps she'll die. In writing, especially expository writing, that's the line of reasoning. Everything needs to be connected, right? So it's important that what you drop in the first premise in terms of your argument, that the second premise connects to it, and then the conclusion of the syllogism also connects to it, and it all echoes back to the thesis and the prompt. So that's, I'm gonna like in the models and exemplars that I have, show you quite literally a delineated line of reasoning, how it all stays connected. So ultimately, what I say to my students is this: good writing equals good thinking. I believe in the potential of all of my students. I know that they all can be very good writers and they have great ideas in their noodles, in their heads. It's just hard to capture it on paper sometimes. So I spend a lot of time with my students actually teaching them deductive and inductive reasoning. So I give them some models, some exemplars of how basic syllogisms work, and then I have them write and present some of their own arguments. They need to get in the habit and sort of train their minds to think in this way. And I'll go over the syllogistic method in just a tad in more detail. But, basically thinking on paper like this: it is unsafe to play in the rain. It is raining today, so it would be dangerous to play now. So in exposition, in the art of composition, usually the body paragraphs occur in a three-step process. And it's a first premise, a second premise, and a conclusion. So skip to the last one here. All human beings are mortal. James is a human being, thus James is mortal, right? So ultimately what we need to do is to get our students to ascertain a text meaning correctly, like get to the authorial intent and the construction of meaning, and then be able to articulate that cogently on paper. So I teach them the difference between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. And we talk about how in arguments in composition or in expository writing, which way to go, inductive or deductive is the best, manner in which to proceed, depending on the prompt and how you want your argument to be spelled out. So I do spend a little bit of time on this. Here are some exemplars, some models that you can steal to talk through this process with your students. So if we're doing The Black Snake by Mary Oliver, immediately we get into the question of how do I construct the introductory paragraph? And for literary analysis, for those of you that are familiar with my work, you know that we always invert the thesis for literary analysis. So you folks that are watching that are AP Lit teachers, FRQ 1, 2, and 3 can be tackled uniformly with the inverted thesis, which I'll model for you in just a second. And then the declarative I exclusively use for rhetorical analysis, and then the other expository modes of synthesis, argument, persuasion, research are a 50-50 split. So implicit in any prompt for literary analysis, you have two questions, right? So what is the authorial intent and how does the author construct meaning? If a student can get to the heart of both of those questions in the introductory paragraph, they're going to have a pretty solid thesis statement. It's just a matter of reading the text correctly. So we did, Socratic seminar, Harkness discussion, Plato's Plato discussion, fishbowl with the black snake, choose your modality, and tore it apart so that the kids have a good sense of what to write and, how to execute this. So in terms of the templates, the declarative thesis works like this. First, every single introductory paragraph that my students write is 4 sentences long as the scaffold, the guardrail are in place, right? So once they have mastery of the template, they can make some choices and have flexibility with it. It's not a paint by numbers sort of thing. So whether they declare or invert, it's going to be 4 sentences long. So this way, it avoids them from doing a couple of things. Putting a restriction on it, ultimately prevents them from doing, the 11 sentence introduction, the 1 sentence introduction that's inadequate, the 1 block paragraph. So giving them some real good parameters. So in this case, you begin with the thesis, sprinkle in the context and background, focus on the tier 2 level vocabulary, manipulate the sentence constructs, 4 sentences. I'm going to bypass this because we're not doing declarative for literary analysis. So in the inverted model, this is how we tackle it. So you end with the thesis. The first 3 sentences are going to answer the question, what is the authorial intent? And that's where you get into the context background. Another way of asking that question is, what is the universal theme of the black snake? So you take 3 sentences to do that. and just get a little bit of context and background of the poem without getting plot heavy on it. The tier 2 vocabulary, let's explain what I mean by that. It's just simply the idea that students should be copying a certain academic tone. So I like to see a few average run-of-the-mill SAT level words, sprinkled into the essay, but I don't want it to sound overly pedantic or contrived. I like to see a good teeter-totter balance between the academic, the colloquial, and the vernacular. And then sentence constructs, many of you are familiar with my work and know that I like how Strunk and White in their book Write It Right, they call it rule number 18. They espouse the idea that there are 12 different ways to construct a sentence, and my students get pretty good at manipulating their syntax and being able to wield different sentence constructs in order to achieve voice rhythm and flow. And as I said earlier, it's going to be exactly 4 sentences. So here's the kicker. All right, you gotta Bob Ross your instruction. I always ask this question: what if we taught composition like Bob Ross teaches painting? And if we do that, we position ourselves as the expert writer in the classroom, just as Bob Ross always positioned himself as the expert painter in The Joy of Painting. And he'd sit there and proceed to paint through whatever the assignment was that particular episode. And for essays, I like to paint with my students and show them, maybe 3 inverted theses, and then I say, on your mark, get set, go. You've seen it 3 times. Do it on your own. So these are some models and exemplars that I would use if I were teaching Black Snake with my students. So first 3 sentences, what is the authorial intent? There is an absolute truth about life. Death is inevitable. And that's what Mary Oliver is getting at, right? So universal truth, authorial intent. That's the exigence. But in knowing this, most choose not to dwell in existential morbidities. Instead, the individual moments of each day unfold with an absent acknowledgment of the fact that each living thing will invariably meet an endpoint. So we're 3 sentences in. Do you see how that's context, background, universal theme, authorial intent? Don't retell the story. Don't regurgitate the poem and make it a Cliff Note synopsis. Just context, background, universal theme, authorial intent. The last sentence is going to be the thesis statement. So how does the author construct meaning? And this is where the student is going to use their literary terms and devices. And I always tell my students, focus on the most salient terms and devices. And like, what are the big ones that Mary Oliver uses to construct meaning? So look at this. Mary Oliver explores this truth through her metaphoric diction and syntax in describing the abrupt ending of a black snake's life. So you may be asking, what does this have to do with there was an old lady who swallowed a fly? The analogy that I'm going to create for my students is this, and bear with me on this because you'll see it happen more fully when we get to the body paragraphs. The old woman, the old lady, and the fly are going to be the introductory paragraph, the thesis statement, the shell of the argument, okay? So what we're going to do in the body paragraphs is come full circle back to this, back to the prompt, back to the authorial intent, back to the construction of meaning in the body paragraphs in order to have a full, clearly delineated line of reasoning. So just keep that in mind. We'll put that in the back burner there. Some people call it the parking lot. So the old lady and the fly are the thesis statement, the context, the background, the answer to the 2 essential questions. So here's another one. I'm going to be done the exact same way. Death is inextricably linked to life, but most people choose not to dwell on that fact every given second. Right? So this starts the same way as the first. Universal theme, authorial intent, flesh it out with 2 more sentences. Even though all life has a lease and that nobody knows the exact time or moment of expiration, one just goes about their daily business as if death is nowhere in the picture. But the fact of the matter is this. Death always looms near and can strike at any moment. So we're 3 sentences in. We answered the question, what is the authorial intent? Gave some context and background. Last sentence, hit me with the terms. Mary Oliver investigates this phenomena through her syntactical manipulation and light-dark imagery in describing the sudden death of a black snake. So you focus on the most salient terms and or devices in that last sentence. Construction of meaning, thesis statement. So again, we're going to put the old lady and the fly there, right? Swallowing the fly is the thesis, all right? So in terms of both of these, let's take a look back. So you can see some complexity with the sentence constructs. Vocab is up, but it's not overly pedantic or geeked out. There's some, little bit of blend of colloquial, vernacular, academic. Same with this. Complex sentence structures for voice, rhythm, flow. Vocab is up, but not overly cooked. So here's one last one. Very simple one, okay? The grim truth about life is that it will inevitably end. And that can be stated as simply as that, right? That's Mary Oliver's main point, right? That's the universal truth of the black snake. And an even starker truth is that one can do nothing to thwart fate's master plan. But in spite of this, most of us choose to live our days as if this isn't the case. So we're 3 sentences in. Mary Oliver, through her depiction of a black snake's demise, arrives at this truth. And that's good enough to get the thesis point. So we're good, right? We've seen 3 examples of how to manipulate the inverted thesis. Students can do this every single time they write literary analysis, no matter the genre, no matter the test. This works uniformly across the board for literary analysis. All right, so let's move on here. How do I write the body paragraphs? You're going to proceed syllogistically, and I'll go over what I mean by that real quick. And ultimately, what I want to do in this is show you how I know an old lady who swallowed a fly can be used as this template piece to help students establish a clear line of reasoning while pulling the strings of the syllogistic method. So in brief, the syllogistic method comes from the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, and they would wrangle with big essential questions. And you might be familiar with one of them from a classic text, Plato's Republic, in which they wrangle the question, what is justice? So a great philosophical think tanker comes to the mic and he says, this is what justice is. And each argument that's proposed in that text is uh, basically constructed as a syllogism. So what I mean by that is when you argue from premise to conclusion. So if I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. I think we'd all say, well, yeah, it's a very cogent argument, Christian. That makes total sense. Ultimately, when our students write, we want them to be that sort of computative, mathematic, logical, cogent, lockstep in their writing. And one of the videos I want to make in the near future is taking a look at anchor papers for AP Lang, AP Lit, and even Regents exams in New York State to show that most students omit the first premise when they argue in their body paragraphs. And that's why there's this seismic shift between the student performing literary analysis to all of a sudden doing plot analysis or making too many plot summative statements that ultimately read like cliff notes. So I'll do that down the road. So for the purposes of performing literary analysis, the first premise is going to be an argument anchored in literary terms and or devices. This is going to take 3 sentences. All right, so make an argument where you focus on the terms and devices. On FRQ 1 for AP Lang, which is the synthesis essay. The College Board gives the direction, your argument must be central. And I wish they would state that on all 6 FRQs, Lang and Lit, because we're, doing expository writing, which is always an act of arguing. And oftentimes, and I've already alluded to this, students cease to write literary analysis and they write plot analysis. So it's really imperative that they argue out of the gate in their body paragraphs. The second premise is going to be their textual support. I like to see a good teeter-totter balance between quoting and paraphrasing. And the conclusion, so I mean the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, is where we're going to echo back to the lady and the fly, links back to the thesis, the prompt. And I always tell my students the first premise is a promise, so it's the handshake back. So we'll show you how that story of an old lady who swallowed a fly can be used to construct the body paragraphs. So as the story goes, the old lady swallows a fly, swallows the spider, swallows the bird, swallows the cat, right? And there's a correlation there in all of these things. Logically, spiders eat flies, birds eat spiders, cats eat birds, right? So, in terms of the logical sequencing of this, I always like it when my students have like a chronology, a sequence, an organizational structure to their writing. So they often ask me this, Mr. Kuhn, where do I begin my analysis? And I always tell them this, no matter the expository mode. Start where the author starts. So you'll see my students using transitions like right from the onset. So cue your reader into the idea that you're organized and that you have a sequence that you're going to adhere to. So I tell them start where the author starts when performing rhetorical analysis or literary analysis. So right from the onset, Oliver creates a contrast between light and dark imagery. All right, so bear with me here. The spider is going to be linked to this binary of light and dark imagery. Okay, look at what the bird does. Further, her syntactical maneuvers accentuate the theme of the piece, death and its inevitable nature. So the bird is going to be linked to the syntax. Look at what the cat does. But the recurrence of circular imagery highlights an important fact. Death is not an end, but a return. So again, I'm going to read this from the top. These are these 3 sentences comprise the first premise. So first premise is a promise, all right, in terms of sustaining the line of reasoning. So look how this flows. Right from the onset, Oliver creates a contrast between light and dark imagery. Further, her syntactical maneuvers accentuate the theme of the piece, death and its inevitable nature. But the recurrence of circular imagery highlights an important fact. Death is not an end, but a return. All right, here's a kicker here. So students need to be able to multitask in their first premise. And what I mean by that is they have to be able to like jigsaw connect how the literary pieces talk to each other. So in this example here, we're connecting the imagery, the syntax, and the circular thematic aspect of the poem together. If students don't do this organizationally, then what they're going to have to do is 1 paragraph theme, 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph diction, right? 1 paragraph metaphor, and proceed that way. In testing situations, it's not practical, and also just in terms of general, composition, it's not a good way to proceed. So we're going to connect all of these things. So as we move to the second premise, which is the 4th sentence, I tell my students, get quoting and paraphrasing. Since you dropped the spider first, you got to go to the spider and get yourself a quote or a paraphrase that corresponds to that. So look at what we talked about here. The contrast in the light and dark imagery. So go get the best quote and best paraphrase to connect to that. Symbolically, it is significant that the snake is black, a color often associated with death, and that it flashed onto the morning road. Bingo. Best quote for that particular literary term, device. One of the things you'll see my students do well is embed their quotes, and there's a little rule I have for that. I call it the 5-word rule. If students place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keep the quote small, it should sound conversational. They may need to bracket. But note the other things that's going on here. Same as the introduction, keep the vocab up without sounding, overly pretentious and pedantic. Focus on those sentence structures for voice, rhythm, and flow. So we quoted, let's analyze that. This is interesting because flashes are typically portrayed by colors associated with light, while mornings bring a return to the light. In this case, the light imagery connotes life itself and the willful oblivion of living creatures to not dwell on its terrible weight, its certain coming. So do you see that this teeter-totter balance of support, analysis, quote, paraphrase? All right. So we got the spider. We definitely got some textual support and analysis going for this binary of the light and dark imagery. Let's bring in the bird. So what's the best quote? What's the best paraphrase to bring in the bird? And again, we're talking about the syntactical maneuvers that Oliver makes are associated or aligned with the bird. So let's jump to that. To depict this theme and capture just how sudden death can cast its shadow on the light of life. Oh, interesting. So the bird is talking to the spider. We're still connected. That's line of reason, right? So we just can't abandon the spider. We got to stay connected to that spider. And that spider is connected to the fly and the old lady. Oliver manipulates her syntax. Given that the truck could not swerve, the fate of the black snake is sealed. The word death is sandwiched by a double hyphen and a comma to indicate this, the fact that its days are numbered and there's nothing to be done. Oliver states it rather matter-of-factly. This is how it happens. All right, the bird is associated with syntax. So all we can talk about here is syntax, right? So you're focusing on the dash, focusing on the comma. Really hard to quote that kind of stuff, so it's more or less paraphrase, but you got a few quotes in here as well. So you can't go on and on and on and on. So it was a quick analysis of that. So what's next? We got our cat. All right. So one never knows when they will leave this earth, but the imagery solidifies the idea that it is not all doom and gloom. Death is not an end, but a new beginning, which is depicted in the idea that now he lies looped and useless as an old bicycle tire, and as cool and gleaming as a braided whip. All right, so this is interesting because all of these are connected, right? There was an old lady who swallowed a fly, and on and on and on, swallows all those things because they're interconnected, right? So now we're at the conclusion of the syllogism. We have to tie these all together. Old lady swallowed the fly, spider, bird, cat. Couple of sentences, keep the promise of the first premise, link it all back to the prompt and the thesis. The tire is circular, as is life, and all life is interconnected and entwined by our shared fate, like the braids of a whip. Even though all living things will one day expire, it's okay, there's a return. Further, life's endpoint is just a natural part of the process that we should not fear or resist. So students often ask me, like, Mr. Kuhn, we're using templates, and when you have us do the introductory paragraph, you want it to be 4 sentences. For syllogistic body paragraphs, how many sentences do you want? How many sentences should I be writing? And I tell them 10 to 12. I find those little itty bitty 4 or 5 sentence baggers that students write just don't have enough support and analysis to fully flesh out an argument. 10 keeps it focused and concise. 12 is kind of the max. Otherwise, they tend to bloviate and may slip into plot synopsis, or set themselves up to break their line of reasoning. So this is a quick way to ensure that that line of reasoning is intact. One of the things that I do a lot of are my alternative grading methods. And for this particular approach, what I do is actually print out, the animals, and model this for students over and over and over again. And on their essays, I have them printed out, cut out the animals, and tape the animals to their essays and then submit it. And they can see for themselves whether or not they've sustained a clear line of reasoning and have adhered to the constructs of the syllogistic method. And they can, really see what they need to work on in terms of staying cogent in their arguments. So it's a pretty neat alternative grading method too, where they can hold themselves accountable and see exactly where they're going awry in their writing or where they're absolutely crushing it. So one of the things that I'm doing with this is, students suggested this. They're like, you use the black snake. I get it. We're talking about an old lady swallowing all these animals and stuff. And his student said, I did a Google search and there's a whole bunch of poems about roadkill. Why don't we do a roadkill unit? So I'm like, why not? So since we're talking about animals. So I modeled how to do this with my students using the black snake, and I'm also going to use Traveling Through the Dark, and they can choose these other poems to do theirs so that they're not stealing my thunder. I like models and exemplars, but I don't want students stealing from me. So the poems that I model are off limits to them. I get that question a lot. Otherwise, it's just, they copycat too much. So in the end here, know that I got a couple of PDs that I'm offering. The Teach It Right 5-week mastermind that I've been offering for quite some time now is going to be offered through the National Writing Project starting August 9th, 2022. And a lot of folks like this because you get a 10-hour PD badge from them, even though we spend it'll be Tuesday nights at 7 Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We spend 5 weeks together, 1 hour a pop. You get 10 hours because there's a little bit of work outside of our sessions together. So if you're looking for some good PD, come join me at the National Writing Project. So it's going to be a good session. And then I'm also going to be doing some webinars with Perfection Learning once the school year begins in September. And in November, I will be with Tim Freitas and Brandon Abden out in Anaheim, California, presenting at the National Council of Teachers of English. So if you would like these slides or any information on the irons I have in the fire, you can feel free to drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. For the NWP things and Perfection Learning, I have a bunch of information on my webpage, which is teachinghowtowrite.com. So be well for now. Happy teaching, happy writing.